All right. Well, hey, good morning, everybody. Thank you. This was just why I would wear to work every week. So as you guys probably know, we've been in this series for a number of weeks. This is week 6 of our series called The Way. And as we've been going throughout the series, we've been tying in all these different hiking concepts. Last week, I talked about how one of our friends, one of our very own small group leaders here at the 11 o'clock, Adam Kaufman, led a group of us on a hiking trip through the Laurel Highlands Trail, this big 70-mile hiking trail. And one of the things that we did that was brilliant and just fun was the 70-mile hiking trail. We broke it up into 3 days on that trip, but we also did every part of that trip in the months leading up to it. And we'd go do a one-day hike of 18 to 25 miles, and we would learn that section of the trip. And even though we didn't have to pack our gear for those little hikes, because we weren't staying the night, we still packed all of our gear because we wanted to know how much gear we needed and how much we really didn't. What proved to be useful and what proved to be kind of useless extra dead weight. And so while we were doing this, there was a lot of things. Those first days, like some of us would overpack and we'd put all this stuff in there that we thought we would need. Anybody here overpack for vacation? Like you are the overpack? I know some of you overpack for vertical camp. I see you guys walking in with an entire carload and all that stuff and panini presses and all that stuff. It's easy to overpack, and what we did for this trip was we wanted to make sure we weren't carrying more weight than we needed to, because quite frankly, when you're carrying too much weight for 70 miles, it becomes exhausting, right? What we ended up finding was we ended up packing like a 35-pound pack. And there's people that we came across while we're hiking that they were carrying 50 pounds. And we're like, what in the world do you need 50 pounds worth of stuff for? I think one of the guys on our trip who didn't do any of the trainings with us was like a 50-pound packer, all right? And he suffered for it. Because when you think about 35 pounds, like that's 4 gallons of milk right there, just to give you some perspective, all right? 35 pounds is 4 gallons of milk. And so it's one thing, like if you were grabbing 4-gallon jugs of milk, you could do that, like carrying it in from the car into the house, right? You could be like, yeah, I could carry 4 gallons of milk into the house. Like that's one thing when you're going from your driveway to the kitchen. It's another thing when you're throwing it on your back and walking 70 miles, right? Then you're like, okay, I want to make sure every ounce of weight that I carry is only the amount of weight that I need. In fact, that's why when you're buying like hiking gear, literally everything is weighed in ounces. Like you want to know, like, all right, how much does this spoon weigh? All right, that's going in my backpack. Like all that stuff comes with a weight on it because people want to know when they're doing those big trips, how much will I be carrying, and how can I make my pack as light as possible? So today, that's the concept we're going to be going into, is this idea of packing light. And in order to do so, in order for us to pack light for life, we have to learn to leave behind the things that really weigh us down. All right, leave behind the things that really weigh us down. It makes me think about this time when I was in high school. I remember the very first girl I dated after I became a Christian. All right, this was my very first, what I'd say was Christian relationship. We were both Christ followers. We both wanted to honor God in our relationship. And this was a first for me in a relationship as a junior in high school. And so I'm dating this girl named Sarah, and there's a lot of amazing things about Sarah. Number one, she was very down to earth. She absolutely loved Jesus. She was passionate about trying to reach people, and she was passionate about making sure she was applying her walk with Christ to her everyday life, every aspect of her everyday life. She wanted her life to be transformed by Christ. This dating relationship was different than any other dating relationships I'd had up to that point, and it was pretty refreshing, all right? But ultimately, this story is not actually about Sarah. This story is really about Chris Heiser, all right? Now, Chris Heiser was Sarah's ex-boyfriend, all right? Chris Heiser was the dead weight that I wanted Sarah to get rid of, right? Like that's what Chris Heiser was, and the thing you need to know about Chris Heiser was Chris Heiser didn't like being Sarah's ex-boyfriend. He definitely wanted to be her future boyfriend again. And he made that very clear to her when he would call her repeatedly and tell her what an idiot I was and why she should drop me and go back to dating him. Like, he made it very clear, as he would not only do that with her, but he would tell all of his friends, like, yeah, this Joel's just a dirtbag and all that stuff. I can't wait for it. Like, he was very public about his dislike for me in our high school. And he wasn't wrong about all of my faults. I just didn't need him to point him out to my girlfriend. All right, and so not only, like, he would talk trash to me to Sarah, he'd talk trash about me to his friends, he'd talk trash about me to random people in the hallway to try to discredit me and discredit our relationship any way possible. So needless to say, Chris and I weren't very tight, right? Like we weren't very close, and so there's this, like I mentioned earlier, how Sarah, number one, she loved God. She loved people, and she was passionate about trying to reach people, and she was passionate about trying to, really apply her life or her faith to her daily life. And Chris, at this point, really didn't have a great relationship with Christ yet. All right, and so Sarah did this really annoying thing this really fun thing where she invited me to go on this high school guys only weekend retreat. All right, and not only did she invite me to go, all right, for this particular trip, you had to be sponsored. And so not only did she sponsor me and say, hey, I'm signing him up, she actually paid my way, too, to make sure that I went. But not only did she do that for me, she annoyingly also did that for her ex-boyfriend, Chris. And not like for a different weekend, for that very same weekend. All right, she invited and paid for the way for both Chris and I to go on this winter retreat for high school guys only. And so I reluctantly went. I'm like, this is going to be stupid. This is going to be frustrating. But you know what? Hey, there's going to be 35 other guys there. It wasn't huge, all right? But I'm going to hang out with the other guy. I'll hang out with my friends. He'll hang out with his friends. And we do have some, like shared friends that we both, know these guys. And, we'll kind of have, shared custody of those friends. We'll take turns with them, all right? And so that was the plan. And God laughed, and he's like, yeah, that's cool. And so I'm like, I'm going to avoid this guy as much as possible. And so one of the things that we did at this winter retreat was they had actually 15 messages that weekend. 15 messages, 12 of them had small group times after them. So we, like we do when we do roundtable in here, for the messages, you sat at the tables, and then you would discuss after the message for a good bit. And so that meant, and then God had this sense of humor where he actually put Chris and I in the exact same small group at the exact same table. So instead of all right, you be at your table with your friends, I'll be at my table with my friends, we had this annoying thing of assigned seating, and I had to sit and dialogue and discuss with Chris for 12 messages, all right? where we had to dive into this discussion. And I don't know, at some point along the way, and I can't pinpoint when it was, something changed where I no longer hated Chris. Maybe it was when he was describing, his home life. Maybe it was when he was describing some of his past. Maybe it was when he was describing some of the things that he struggled with. And I'm like, I actually kind of relate to him. As he's kind of laying out like that, he grew up in a home with divorce too, just like I did. His family had some financial hardships, just like mine did. He had some things that he struggled or wrestled with, just like I did. And before he knew it, I'm like, I actually relate to Chris quite a bit. We have a lot in common. All right, and eventually at some point I'm like, not only do I have a lot in common, I actually kind of like him. I don't fully hate him. Before I knew it, by the time we walked out of those church doors that Sunday afternoon, I grew closer to Chris than I did any other person that entire week. The person that I wanted to avoid like the plague, all right, became one of my best friends by the end of that week, which is absolutely insane. And so while I went into this weekend just carrying around this monumental amount of weight, God wasn't happy with that. God wasn't satisfied with that. And he called me. God put me in a place and a position to force me to make a decision on whether I was going to choose to shed that weight or not. And so luckily, by the end of that weekend, while I was carrying around all this baggage of bitterness and frustration and, quite frankly, just hatred towards Chris, by the end of the week, I was able to shed it. By the end of the week, I was able to let it go, and I was able to move forward in freedom, all right, and a lightness to me. And that was while diving through high school and learning about all the things that you'll never use, like learning the molar mass of different atoms and how to find the circumference of a sphere and all this other stuff and that you don't use in daily life. All right, those things that they don't teach you in high school, those things that God teaches you, like learning how to forgive people even when you don't want to. That was it was one of the hardest lessons I learned while I was in high school. It was one of the most valuable lessons, one of the most valuable life-changing lessons I ever learned. All right, and it wasn't learned in the classroom. It was learned through the textbook of life. And so today, that's what we're going to be diving into, is this idea of forgiveness and what it looks like to truly forgive and to let go and to shed the extra weight. But in order to do this, first we have to understand what forgiveness is. All right, what forgiveness is. And a couple things to kind of think about on what forgiveness is. First thing is that it's to cease to feel, or to stop feeling that resentment towards the other person. It's choosing to let go of that resentment. That the second thing is it's to give up the need for retaliation. All right, and the third thing is it's to grant relief to that person from repayment, meaning you don't hoard over their head anymore. All right, you're not seeking an opportunity to get them back, right? And you're no longer holding it over their head like, hey, you owe me. All right, remember that you did this. You owe me. It's letting go of all of that stuff. But the reason why forgiveness is so hard for us to comprehend sometimes is it's against our human nature, right? It's our human nature to hold grudges. It's our human nature to hold on to that resentment and that bitterness and all of that weight. But that's against God's nature. See, it's so part of human nature. Think about like cancel culture, which kind of erupted onto the scene like 7 years ago. Like where people just get canceled for, something stupid that they did like, 18 years before or whatever, all right? And then like their whole entire career, their life and all that stuff just gets uprooted because, well, they made a mistake. And I want to feel better about myself, so I'm going to judge you really harshly for that. Let's think about how cancel culture works for a second. First, all right, step one is somebody makes a mistake, right? Step two is everything that person has ever done or said or ever will must be thrown out because of some Halloween costume they wore in 1993. Like that's cancel culture, right? And then the third thing is all of their life's work, all right? All of their life's work, every movie they've ever made, every song they've ever wrote must be erased from all of human history with no hope of redemption or restoration. That's cancel culture, right? The rest of their life is now defined by the court of public opinion, whether the public opinion is actually right or not. Like, that's how cancel culture works. And cancel culture, like, it might feel like it's a new thing because it has a new term to it that's came out in, like, this last generation. But it's not new, right? This is how society has always worked, at least human society, until godliness steps in. In the New Testament, you see a guy, he's a high priest of Israel while Jesus is serving his ministry. And he's the high priest of Israel. His name's Caiaphas. And Caiaphas, he is like the spiritual leader of the nation of Israel. Like he is the top dog. He's the guy that people are looking to guide the nation. And this rogue preacher named Jesus shows up on the scene. And Caiaphas doesn't like it. Caiaphas is supposed to be the top dog, right? Caiaphas is supposed to be the guy that everybody's coming to looking for wisdom. And here's this Jesus guy. He's teaching people. He's changing the way people see and view the world. He's changing the way people live and interact. He's introducing all these new concepts that we live by today, but back then they're like, these are brand new. We take them for granted because we're like, yeah, that's kind of obvious. No, it's obvious because we've been practicing for the last 2,000 years. All right, and so he's teaching all these new concepts. He's healing people. And Caiaphas is like, this Jesus dude's bad for business. I don't like him. People are going to him and not me. And so he's starting to get jealous, and he wants to find a way to take Jesus out. Jesus eventually gets arrested, is standing on trial before the 70 leaders of Israel, spiritual leaders of Israel, including Caiaphas, who's overseeing this kind of mock trial. And just take a look at it. It says the chief priests and the whole Sanhedrin were looking for false evidence against Jesus so they could put him to death. Caiaphas hated Jesus so much that he was looking for any reason that he could kill him, even if he knew he was asking people to give false testimony to make it happen. He's like, I don't care who comes up. I don't care if you have to lie. Give me a reason to get rid of this guy. All right? It says, but they did not find any, even though there's a lot of false witnesses that came forward. Like, these false witnesses were so bad, they had nothing on them, that even the stuff that the garbage they were making up was like, that's not even good enough. Like, you can't even, like, make up a good lie against Jesus. It says, finally, 2 people came forward and said, hey, this fellow, Jesus said, I'm able to destroy the temple of God and rebuild it in 3 days. And then the high priest stands up, Caiaphas, and said to Jesus, he says, are you not going to answer? He says, what is this testimony that these men are bringing against you? But Jesus remained silent. All right, think about that for a second. Think about being 100% in the right and just sucking it up. That's so hard to do. And then Jesus, the high priest, said to him, he says, I charge you under oath by the living God. All right, tell us if you are the Messiah, the Son of God. Jesus looks at him and is like, hey, you said so. You have said so, he replied. He says, but I say to all of you, from now on you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of God, of the Mighty One, and coming on the clouds of heaven. So he's like, yeah. And he busts out some Old Testament prophecy, like, hey, here's the promise about me, the Messiah, to come. It says, then the high priest tears his clothes and he said, he has spoken blasphemy. All right, putting himself on the same level as God. Why do we need any more witnesses? Look, you have now heard the blasphemy. What do you think? He is worthy of death, they answered. So they spit in his face, struck him with their fists, and the others slapped him and said, prophesy to us, Messiah, who hit you? All right, you can see this all laying out where there's this hatred, there's this deep, deep desire to discredit Jesus and to just entirely cancel his ministry for no other reason than the fact that Caiaphas thought it made him look bad. All right, this is nothing new, this idea of cancel culture. You see, we see Caiaphas, his natural state is to jump to conclusions, to rush to judgment, to quickly land on condemnation. They're like, yeah, let's just kill this guy, which is not too far from cancel culture, right? Meanwhile, we see another Pharisee in the New Testament by a guy named Nicodemus in John chapter 3. And we see Jesus ushering in something new in this conversation with Nicodemus. So while Caiaphas was so desperate to find any flaw he could in Jesus, all right, even if he had to make it up just to make it happen, Nicodemus instead seeks Jesus with questions. All right, he seeks to understand before being understood. And so he takes time to get to know him. He takes time to learn about him. It says in John 3, it says, now there was a Pharisee named... a man named Nicodemus, who was a member of the Jewish ruling council. He says, he came to Jesus at night and said, Rabbi, we know that you are a teacher who has come from God. For no one could perform the signs you are doing if God were not with him. Jesus replied, very truly I tell you. He says, no one can see the kingdom of heaven, all right, unless they are born again. All right, how can someone be born when they are old? Nicodemus asked. He says, surely they can't enter into, a second time to their mother's womb to be born again. And Jesus looks at Nicodemus like, dude, call it an analogy, all right? Like, let's just stick with me here, all right? It's a metaphor. It's not that complicated. So he goes on to tell him this whole idea of new life in Christ and about being reborn. He goes on and says the famous verse in John 3:16, and I always jump into 17 as well because it's super important. It says this, it says, for God so, like, why? Why is God doing all this? Because he's trying to usher in a brand new culture, all right, a forgiveness culture, if you will. He says this, he says, for God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish, but have eternal life. He says this, he says, for God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but to save the world through him. See, while in our human nature, we love to jump to conclusions, we love to jump to hatred, to bitterness, and unforgiveness, God did the exact opposite. God, who's the only one that's perfect, all right, who would be fully justified and just sticking with condemnation, be like, I'm God, and y'all suck, all right, I'm out. He'd be totally justified in it. He's like, no. Not only do I want them so much that I'm willing to forgive them, I also recognize that forgiveness comes at a cost, and I'm willing to pay it myself. And that's exactly what Jesus did. So what it says is, for God did not send his Son in the world to condemn the world, but that save the world through him. See, that was God's plan. Romans 5:8, Paul puts it a really cool way. He says this. He says, God demonstrates his love for us in this, that while we were still sinners, which another translation says, while we were still enemies toward God, Christ died for us. Meaning, while I was still standing in opposition, while I was still fighting Jesus tooth and nail, he was willing to go to the cross for me. And you even see that laid out and when you read the story of Jesus on the cross, where Jesus is literally praying for the people as they're beating him. As they're beating him, as they're mocking him, he's like, hey, Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing. All right? The thief on the cross that Jesus looks to him and says, hey, today you'll be with me in paradise. That's the same guy who was mocking Jesus about an hour before that, who was making fun of him and saying, hey, if you're really a son of God, why don't you get yourself and us down off these crosses? All right, the same guy that was mocking Jesus, Jesus like, hey, you want to come hang out with me after this? you want to go be friends? That's the kind of radical love we see Jesus demonstrate as he introduces this whole new idea that was so countercultural as he introduces this idea of a forgiveness culture. See, forgiveness culture is against our human nature, but it's the very thing that makes us the most Christ-like. For those of you who've been in your prayer life and be like, God, just help me be more like you. God, I just want to be more Christ-like. I just want to respond more Christ-like. Help me to be more like you, Jesus. If that's been your prayer, this is the starting blocks, right? This is the way God introduced that. If there's nothing that makes you look more like Jesus than to learn to forgive those that honestly you might not feel like deserve your forgiveness. Because quite frankly, I didn't deserve God's forgiveness either, but he pursued me with forgiveness anyway. And so when we do that same thing, we look more like Jesus than any other point in our walk with Christ. Paul puts it this way. Paul, the same guy who was going around murdering Christians, like let's think about this for a second. There's this guy named Paul who was going around killing Christians, and that it would have been really easy for obviously all the Christians to be like, I hate that guy. That guy killed my cousin. That guy killed my wife. That guy took everything from me. Like, if there's anybody I don't want to see in heaven with me someday, it's probably that guy, right? It's probably that guy who took everything from me and my family because he hated God. He hated this Jesus guy so much. That's probably the guy that you're not thinking you're one day going to refer to as your brother in Christ. But that's exactly what God made him into. All right, that same guy who was killing Christians, who's now forgiven by God, who's now bringing Christianity to the world, all right, bringing the good news of Christ to the world, he says this. He says, be kind and compassionate to one another. All right, remember, you've probably heard me say this a lot. Anytime you see something that's written in the New Testament, like challenges like this, the reason why Paul's writing it is because it's the exact opposite of what people are doing. He's writing to the church here. And so if he's saying, hey, be kind and compassionate to one another, guess what people weren't doing? It was being kind and compassionate to one another. People were harboring bitterness. They were harboring unforgiveness. They were letting Satan drive wedges between them and their friend groups and even in the church. And he says, so how do we do this? He says, by forgiving each other. Well, how do we forgive each other? Well, Jesus gave us a pretty good example. He says, just as Christ, all right, just as in Christ, God forgave you. How do I forgive people? Well, it's being willing to sacrifice even for them, even when I don't understand them, even when I don't like them, even when they are fighting me tooth and nail, just like Jesus did. He goes on and says this other thing in Colossians 3. He says, bear with each other. All right, this idea of bearing with each other, this is like, anybody play sports? You guys know when you get punished as a team because somebody did something that they shouldn't have, and you're like, now you're running sprints, you're running all these laps and stuff like that, and that same person happens to be dogging it on the field then too. Like you're running laps, and they're like, yeah, Charlie wasn't running his hardest still, so you got to go again, guys. You're like, Charlie, come on, dude. Like I'm about ready to kick you off the team myself. Like let's get it together. That's what it means to bear with each other. It means to suffer through each other. That even when somebody's not carrying their weight, even when somebody's not doing what they're supposed to, it's saying, hey, suck it up anyway. All right, Jesus, as he's going to the cross, it wasn't like we were stepping up like, hey, my bad, Jesus, let me help you carry this. No, he carried my cross on his own, all right, and he bared with me anyway. All right, he bore with me anyway. So it says, bear with each other and forgive one another if you have any grievance against somebody. He doesn't qualify. He's like, if it's relevant to this, forgive. If it's these other areas, then you don't have to. No, he doesn't give any qualifiers. He's like, if you have any grievance against someone, how should I forgive? He says, well, forgive as the Lord forgave you. And I don't know about you, but it turns out that there's not a single thing in my life that God hasn't forgiven and isn't willing to forgive. There's a single thing in my life that God's not willing to move on from. But it's all right. Let's move forward. Let's start new. Make it fresh, and let's start new. So the same goes towards us and others. And I gave a lighthearted example earlier of some dude that tried to date my girlfriend and all that stuff. But I have plenty of examples, thousands of examples of where maybe it was even harder for me to forgive. Whether it was my stepdad who was extremely abusive, or a bunch of other stuff in my life, maybe sometimes it's even hardest for me to forgive myself. Maybe sometimes that was the forgiveness I really struggled with. But the thing is Jesus wants to usher in a forgiveness culture. He wants us to live out a forgiveness culture. So that means, one, learning to forgive ourselves. It means learning to allow Jesus to forgive us and know that he's not wanting to hold that over our heads. He didn't go to the cross so that he could still hold on to our baggage. All right, he already paid for it there. But not only that, all right, he wants us to learn how to forgive like he did. If for no other reason, sometimes we don't like to forgive because we feel like we're letting the person off the hook. When really what it's ultimately doing is it's allowing us to drop the baggage, right? It's allowing us to drop the bitterness. It's allowing us to drop the weight. And it's allowing us to walk free and new and no longer tethered, no longer weighed down to that old stuff. All right, and so the big thing that helped me learn how to forgive Chris, the big thing I learned was I learned to empathize with him. All right, it doesn't mean I agreed with everything he said. Doesn't mean I agreed with everything he did. But I learned to recognize that he was human. And part of his human nature was that he was going to frustrate me and make my life difficult. All right? And so as we learn that lesson, we can learn to forgive people, not because they deserve it, but because we deserve it. We deserve to be set free from that baggage and that weight. And as we do, we begin to look more like Christ than we could ever even imagine. Let's pray. God, I just thank you so much for everybody in this room. Lord, I thank you for the great lengths that you went through to forgive us, but also to teach us how to forgive too, so we can be set free from that bitterness and baggage. Lord, I know a lot of us carry some lighthearted stuff, but a lot of us carry some heavy stuff too that are really difficult to forgive. And Lord, it doesn't mean that we instantly become best friends and, do all of